Hi, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner. Welcome to tonight's edition of The Robust Opposition. We have a great guest for you, Frank Tamborello, who is with Hunger Action LA right here in Los Angeles. How you doing, Frank?
I'm doing pretty good tonight. How about yourself?
I'm great. Except, I'm always sad when we have to talk about yet another horrible thing that the Trump administration and the Republicans are trying to do, which is cut food stamps, which, as we know, is very much important to poor people in this country. Before we get into our discussion, I wanted to just read your bio so people have a little bit of understanding about you. You got into organizing and you worked on utility rate and affordable housing issues in Texas before you came to California 25 years ago. And now you're the director of Hunger Action LA, as I mentioned, which advocates for anti-poverty policies, and it helped overturn the long-standing ban on CalFresh benefits for people with past drug felonies. And CalFresh is what we call food stamps here in Los Angeles. Hunger Action LA and its allies are on the verge of another victory in changing state policy to allow SSI recipients, which are 1.5 million blind, disabled, and senior Californians, to also access CalFresh benefits. Hunger Action LA also operates a benefits matching program at 23 farmers markets, which is it still called the Market Match program, Frank?
Yeah, it's still called Market Match, and yep, still reaching a lot of folks out there.
Yeah, I wanted to let people know that this is how I met Frank back in 2009 or 10. Antonio Villaraigosa, when he was mayor, he started the Los Angeles Food Policy Council, which was a bunch of organizations and activists that were working on food issues from all different angles, farmers markets. We even had grocery stores such as Whole Foods, school food program, community gardens, urban agricultures, different organizations. And it was a very successful model. We had a lot of different working groups. And I learned about Frank and his Market Match program, which allows people to use their CalFresh benefits at farmers markets. Do you want to talk a little bit about that program before we get into tonight's topic, Frank?
Oh, absolutely. So not only are people able to use their CalFresh benefits at the farmers markets, they're able to get double the amount for what they spend up to a limit of $10, but that's still like 40 extra dollars a week if you went to the same farmers market every week. And the funds can only be used on California grown fruits and vegetables. So it's a sort of I call it a four-way win-win because it alleviates hunger, it promotes healthy eating, it supports the local farm economy because these are just the farmers coming in from the 100-mile radius or so of LA. And in the long run, it supports the environment because it helps promote this kind of sustainable agriculture. So it's a four-way win.
Great. Now, really interesting because when you and I met, I joined that food policy council because I was thinking about starting a food truck in South LA, which also would have had multiple missions. It would have provided low-cost, nutritious meals to residents of a food desert. It would have purchased produce from urban farmers, urban agriculture, to show that urban agriculture would be a viable model. And also it would employ disadvantaged youth to teach them how to get entrepreneurial skills operating a food truck. And I researched that for about 6 months. And in the fall of that year, 2011, the Occupy movement hit. And I joined that and never looked back and realized that I had much more of a head for being an activist than operating a business, whether it was nonprofit or, possibly for profit, but a socially responsible business. But I remember the very first protest I ever organized myself was called Occupy 90210. And it was to protest Obama when he was appearing at a fundraiser in Holmby Park. And the Foo Fighters were the special guests. And we were having our demonstration in the park across from the Beverly Hills Hotel, which was just less than a mile away from the fundraiser. And it became the site of many protests I did in subsequent years. But I felt like at the time, everybody knew what Occupy was against. and I wanted us to be for something. So I called you and I said, what would be a good cause to raise money for? And you said, why, our market match program, of course. And so we did that. And I don't know that we actually raised money, but we basically told people that for the $32,500 a plate that people were paying to have dinner with Obama that night, they could feed like 17,250 people at a food bank, because you could feed people for $2 a meal. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, well, that's the way the story always goes, right? I remember when we were advocating for low-income housing in Hollywood, and housing is, of course, the top issue in LA right now. In fact, housing is very intimately tied in with hunger, because most people in LA who don't have enough food don't have enough because they've got to pay all the money for the rent. Well, the big parking lot that they built at Hollywood and Highland for people to come in and park was $100 million, which at the time they were struggling to find $100 million to afford to fund the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And that was the whole cost of it right there, was the parking lot. So there's always this battle between, it's very easy for government entities to spend a hell of a lot of money on something like that, something that in the long run they're going to benefit from, than to actually help people, which also helps the economy in its own way. For example, food stamps, which we're talking about a lot tonight, every $5 of food stamp spending is $9, translates into $9 in the local economy. And that happens a lot of different ways. That happens because people can afford to buy more food, so more food's being sold. The grocery stores are busier, so they can hire more people. And people can spend some of their other money on items that have sales tax on them. So, there's no reason for anyone to oppose food stamp programs, SNAP, call it nationwide, because it's another program that's a win for everybody involved.
Going back to that Occupy Fights Hunger event, I decided that the market match program that you had was a wonderful program, and we should start fundraising for it in farmers markets in well-off areas like Beverly Hills, like Brentwood, like Mar Vista. And I remember trying to get the city of Beverly Hills to allow us to have a table there. I literally had to make a presentation before the study session of the Beverly Hills City Council. And they basically blocked it, basically saying that the only people that could have tables there were local Beverly Hills organizations, which I thought was really insane. But we ended up doing it. We ended up doing this whole big program. I spent a whole summer working on it. It was a 3-month program. And we did it first at the Mar Vista Farmers Market, where the market manager, Diana, couldn't have been happier to have us there. And we tabled and we raised money for the market match program. And we also had, you connected me with the person who works for the Department of, what's the name of that department that runs the food stamps?
The Department of Public Social Services, the DPSS.
Yes, so you connected me with the woman, and we're going back now 7 years, so I forget her name, who ran that. And she ended up bringing the mobile unit where they signed people up to the Mar Vista's Farmers Market. Then I did it the following month in South LA at the Ralph's on Crenshaw Boulevard. And again, they brought the mobile unit, and we signed up so many people.
Yeah.
And I remember the reason I did this program was I found out that at the time, only 51% of people who were eligible for this program were taking advantage of it. Can you maybe tell people why so few people took advantage of it, and what's happened in the 7 years since?
Well, there's always been a lot of confusion about the rules of SNAP, or CalFresh as we call it now. But let me just say that when I first started in this kind of work, they weren't encouraging anyone to sign up at all. The idea was to try to have as few people sign up as possible. And in fact, if you go back far enough in time, you'll find a time when it was not legal to even do outreach for the program. All of that changed with the big welfare reform, the Newt Gingrich contract on America, as we call it, in the 1990s, which proved to be a big threat to not just to low-income people getting assistance as they're under attack again now, but also to the economy and to be blunt about it, those state and county bureaucracies that operate the programs. They were under threat too. So the attitude did a whole 180. Now, 7 years ago, yes, the enrollment rate hovered around 51%, but due to just a lot of diligent work on the part of the county, as well as a lot of partner organizations, lots of nonprofits I could name here, go on, ranging from Maternal Child Health Access, does a hell of a lot of work, the food bank, LA Regional Food Bank, and others. That enrollment rate is now up around 70%, but it still has a ways to go. And the County Board of Supervisors last year actually passed a motion saying, we want to increase this enrollment rate by another 20% by the middle of 2019, which is next year. So the timing for this stuff going up on the federal level is really bad.
Yes. So that brings us into discussing what is happening on the federal level. And I remember 5 years ago, because the Farm Bill is reauthorized every 5 years. And I remember 5 years ago doing a video, which I will post in the link to this show. We were lobbying Henry Waxman, who was my congressperson at the time. And because they had draconian cuts in the Farm Bill, cuts to food stamps in the Farm Bill, and we lobbied him. And I remember we convinced him to vote no on the Farm Bill, but the Farm Bill still passed with those cuts. Well, now it's, 5 years later, they're doing a new Farm Bill, and apparently the Senate bill doesn't have any cuts to food stamps, but the House bill has draconian cuts. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
So yeah, the House bill has a lot of really, really bad proposals in it. Most of the cuts in the House bill, which amount to like $20 billion over the next 5 years, they come from increasing the work requirements that are in the SNAP program. There already are work requirements in the program. If you're between 18 and 50, you have to work 20 hours a week or be in an approved workfare program. Now, you can get exempted from those requirements if the economy's bad. And up until the end of last year, so many states opted for those exemptions. The proposals in the new Farm Bill, which fortunately got defeated a few weeks ago, this is the House Farm Bill, they proposed increasing the age of work requirement to age 60. And instead of exempting people who had dependent kids, it was only going to exempt people who had dependent kids under 6. And so if you weren't working 20 hours a week and there was no real provisions for a workfare program, then you would be cut off for like a year the first time, and then 3 years the second time, and 5 years or something like that the third time. Now think about all the people who are working in retail jobs right now. They're impacted because their hours aren't the same every week. You and I both know people who work at Target, places like that. They get phone calls in the middle of the day. Hey, you're only working 15 hours this week. Or, hey, your hours go up next week. So people like that, which is a large number of people who are getting food assistance, would run the risk of being cut off just because they didn't make 20 hours in a particular week.
Yeah, it's pretty outrageous, really. I remember, reading on the front page of the New York Times about Starbucks and how they were changing their policy because they weren't letting people know until right before their shifts when their hours would be that week. And I remember there was a story about a woman who was a mother, and she had her mother watching her kids when she worked, and her mother's job was getting threatened because she kept having to call in sick or whatever so she could watch her grandchildren. And it was so embarrassing to Howard Schultz, to have this come out publicly, that they decided to change their policies. And we know that, Howard Schultz, who recently was in the news by basically saying, we can't afford these programs. He was saying that the Democratic Party is going too far to the left. And he recently resigned from being CEO of Starbucks. And people are thinking that he's possibly going to run for president. So I don't remember which news show he was on, but he was saying, we can't afford these programs. Meanwhile, of course, we know that we can afford to bail out the banks. We can afford endless wars. And the worst thing to me, what everybody's all upset about this week, is the poor children from the immigrants coming and seeking asylum here who are being ripped from the arms of their mothers. And I just found out that the services for the detentions, well, we knew it was a private prison that are providing it. Like I covered the protest at a Core Civic, which used to be the Corrections Corporation of America, their facility down at Otay Mesa last Sunday. But now I find out that General Dynamics, which is a defense contractor, and another one called MDM Incorporated are being hired to, or being contracted to provide the services for all these children that they're ripping from the arms of their mothers. So they are actually profiting off of these horrific policies that, could be called child abuse, pretty much.
It's the new version of the flesh trade. This and the privatized prisons, it's all part of the same thing, where people who are being held against their will essentially are being tooled around in exchange for bucks, and someone's getting paid to house them or to abuse them. It's the same as what's happening in prison. And some of those same companies, I believe, do also run private prisons, and so they have experience in both caging people and in abusing them.
Yeah, I mean, it's really so horrific. And, it's good to see that some of the legislators, on the Senate side, Bernie Sanders, Jeff Merkley, on the Congress side, Pramila Jayapal and Ro Khanna are coming out against this and trying to do something. But there's very little they can do when the Republicans are in power, and they're essentially saying that our Attorney General Jeff Sessions is essentially saying they're doing this on purpose to try to keep people from coming to this country. I mean, how sick is that?
It's pretty sick. It's like a deep psychological disorder, and it's sort of become manifest in the kind of leaders that, unfortunately, a plurality of Americans have chosen to represent them.
Yeah.
And that same kind of mentality is behind a lot of the proposed changes in food stamps and in other programs like that. It's like, make people work, not because you sincerely want to get them a job or get them trained to work, but because you're going to make a requirement that most people won't be able to fulfill. And so you'll be able to chop them off the rolls. And again, they'd rather spend all that money on something else. Now, the most recent version of the House Farm Bill was put up for a vote in May. That was the one with all these draconian things we're talking about. And it was defeated. But it was defeated by the unusual coalition of all the Democrats, plus the most extreme far-right Republicans, who said, well, first of all, they said it doesn't go far enough. They wanted it to be even worse and cut even more people off. But they tried to make a deal with the other Republicans, and they said, look, we'll support your farm bill that we hate if you bring up these immigration bills. The immigration bills they're talking about are a couple of the ones that are being discussed now. And at the time, the mainstream Republicans balked. They didn't bring up the immigration bills, and so the farm bill went down to defeat. And it's the Senate, as you mentioned earlier, they don't have any such cuts to SNAP in the farm bill. So, we can thank our senators too for not putting bad cuts in there, but it's also a good thing to call our senators and not only encourage them to resist any cuts to SNAP, but to really put some things in there to improve the program. And one reason I say that is because that awful House bill is going to come up for another vote. This time they've traded the immigration votes. And when the House passes their version, Senate passes their version, then they have to do a conference committee. And so they'll compromise from whatever both have proposed. And if what the Senate has proposed is like just so 50-50 status quo, that means we'll probably still end up with some cuts unless they make a really, really strong fight against it.
Yeah, well, I'm concerned about that because I was watching Jeff Merkley's press conference from outside that former Walmart warehouse in Texas, and he had a bunch of congressmen with him. And they were basically saying that they are holding this program hostage to the immigration bill. And they are going to have an immigration vote and the wall and the whole 9 yards. And they're playing such hardball with this that I am really worried about what's going to happen. And I personally feel, and I feel this way about a lot of things, horrible things that Trump and the Republicans are doing, that, while of course we have to contact our representatives, and even more so the Democrats who are represented by dinos, what we call Democrats in name only. There are people like Mark Warner and Heidi Heitkamp and Joe Donnelly, and even now the new one, Doug Jones, that vote with the Republicans because they're worried about maintaining their seat. So a lot of these bills that could have been close if we even had a couple of Republicans on our side, like, say, Susan Collins or Lisa Murkowski, they get killed because all the Democrats don't vote together because they're voting like Republicans. We got to get rid of those guys. But personally, I feel like we should call them, but we have to prevail upon our Republican friends, if any of us have Republican friends, to call their representatives, because those are the ones that have to be convinced. And, it was really heartening to see that the Baptist Church has a new leadership now. They used to be very Caucasian. They used to be very racist. They just elected a new a president who is African-American, who is now talking about disassociating themselves with the Republican Party over this very policy that they're pursuing, which is so inhumane. So, what do you think people should be doing just besides calling their representatives?
It's there has to be a way to manifest the way people truly feel. In the case of the religious leaders, it's a welcome sign, although it's really sad that they should be leading, people, and instead they had to be dragged kind of kicking and screaming. Things had to get so bad that people's kids were being torn away at the border. That's what finally made them change their minds.
Yeah.
So, it's calling representatives, but just waking people up to more of what's going on. So much of the racism that's the undercurrent of the Trump administration, I believe it comes from a lot of towns and places where it's 99% white and people don't even have the experience of living with people of other ethnicities. So they have nothing to go by except what they hear, what gets fed to them on certain media outlets, Fox News, let's go ahead and say it. And it's just waking people up to realities and exposing them to, like a personal experience of people. That's what good may come out of this horrific treatment of people that's going to leave these kids traumatized for the rest of their lives. But it's a big awakening of people.
This also puts me in mind of the churches and synagogues here in Los Angeles. There's a program called Safe Parking, and it's basically for our exploding homeless population, many of whom are living in cars or RVs that are not allowed to park on the streets. Mike Bonin was actually, although he's totally turned around, but he originally proposed this parking ban. And when I interviewed him about it at a protest at City Hall steps, he basically said, oh, no. What he was trying to do was have the parking, but, in the industrial zones, because people didn't want it in front of their businesses. They didn't want it in front of their homes. So it was going to be in industrial zones. And I said, but those are the worst places because they're deserted and they're not safe. And when mothers, single moms with kids, it's very unsafe. So that's why a private entity started this safe parking program that's contracting with the city. They're getting some funding. And there's only a couple, I think less than 5 churches and synagogues that are actually allowing their parking lots to be used for this at night. Can you imagine? These are religious people. Also, I'd like to know about the right to life people that are so concerned about the fact of life, but once the life is brought into the world, they could care less about them.
Yeah. Well, I'm really proud to say that the church where our office is located for Hunger Action LA is participating in the safe parking program. And, it's funny. Again, we see our county really adopting a really progressive stance. Some of the programs that the county is moving forward with on homelessness are things that we suggested 10 years ago, but got laughed out of their offices because it was considered too ridiculous.
Yeah.
And No, and now we're seeing the reverse of when I first came to LA and we were picketing the city and the county for not doing enough about it. Now we're defending people in the city and county because some of our neighbors are protesting shelters. Koreatown is just one example, but it's happening also in Bonnett's district. It's happening in the valley and in Venice. There's just a lot of NIMBYism pushback, and
Yeah,
this
I know. I argue with them
gentrification too.
all. I argue with them all the time on
Yeah.
Nextdoor. I happen to be in Nextdoor with Studio City, and Paul Krikorian wants to put a homeless shelter on Ventura Boulevard. And I swear, half the people. I mean, there are a handful of people who are compassionate and understand the problem, but I would say more than half the people, the vast majority of the people are commenting, are basically saying, we don't want this shelter in here. And they're characterizing homeless people as, drug addicted, mentally deranged, violent criminals who defecate on their front lawn. I mean, it's just horrible, the stereotypes. And I try to say, there by the grace of God go you. I mean, the biggest increase in homelessness is because of a lack of affordable housing. And the LA Times even had an article that said if the rents rise another 5% in this city, that's another 2,000 people on the streets.
Well, the big study came from Zillow, who are not known to be a far left company, a real estate company that warned about, increasing rents was going to increase homelessness. And in my experience in the last few years, I've seen that gentrification often has a much larger impact, even than cuts in the safety net programs we're talking about. I mean,
Yeah.
it's really horrible what's being proposed for SNAP and other programs at the federal level. And we have to fight against that. But at the same time, how do we organize to fight against some of the economic forces that they have? There's policies backing up gentrification. You have to dig around to find it sometimes, but whether it's letting buildings, go without a CEQA, an environmental quality review, speeding up that review, displacing large numbers of people from housing, having people forcing them to go further and further to look for something they can afford. This is the primary cause of homelessness and of hunger also in our county. And it's a shame that for having so many progressives, locally, we have just the worst thing to show for it in the terms of our poverty rate.
Now, can you define for the viewers the difference between being hungry and being food insecure? Because so often you talk to people and they say, oh, look at all these poor people. They're so fat. Surely they're not hungry.
Well, I've never actually liked the term food insecure, but because I always thought it was a euphemism to kind of blanket over the fact that people were hungry. But let me talk to you a little bit about a lot of people with disabilities. SSI, this is one of the programs we work with a lot. It's supplemental security income. So a lot of people with SSI, they get $900 a month. And up until this point, and not changing until next year, they can't get CalFresh benefits. So imagine having to pay all your rent, all your transportation, all your food, and everything else with $900 a month. What kind of food are you going to be able to afford? It's going to be high starchy, high fat, high salt, high sugar content, the cheapest thing that's out there. Potato chips, bologna, things like that, especially if you have no cooking facilities. You're going to get a belly on you whether you're getting enough to eat or not.
Yeah.
But what you're certainly not getting is enough nutritious food.
Right.
I'm going to stop here, but I want to come back with a story about one of our colleagues that perfectly illustrates the whole health and food dichotomy.
Well, I remember, yeah, we had on our food policy council where you and I met, we had the California Endowment, and we actually even had, if I recall correctly, people from health organizations. I want to say the insurance companies, but I could be wrong, recognizing that they had to deal with this issue of food because it related so much to diabetes, and they were paying so much out for diabetes and heart disease and all these diseases that were caused by lack of good nutritious food.
So this is our friend Ronald, who has given me permission to spread his story far and wide. Ronald gets SSI, so he gets Medi-Cal. He estimates that the state spends $40,000 a year on his health care. He sees an endocrinologist. He gets 6 separate medications from the state. When he went into the hospital for a knee operation, his blood sugar level was perfect because they were giving him the right kind of food that he needs because he has diabetes. Soon as he left the hospital, he could not afford that food, and his sugar skyrocketed again. And so the state's spending $40,000 a year for his health care when he says that $100 to $150 per month could help him afford the kinds of fresh vegetables he needs to keep that in check. So he's just one example. And, there's millions of people getting Medi-Cal in the state, and how many have diabetes? How many deal with the same situation?
I was thinking back to what you said about the council and the supervisors and how they're seemingly so progressive all of a sudden. And I'm wondering if it has to do with the fact that homelessness has now come out of Skid Row. They can't contain it anymore. And it's now in everybody's neighborhoods. I mean, I live here in the canyons above Beverly Hills, and there was this big skirball fire that happened in December. One of the major fires happened as a result of a cooking fire at an encampment in Bel Air, okay, in the hills above Bel Air. So this was another thing that the people on Nextdoor were all exercised about, was these homeless people. And somebody that I had served on the Benedict Canyon Association with back in the late 80s, early 90s, when I first moved here, a woman was basically saying, we kept saying that something, like this, we had to wait until a catastrophe happened. And I had to say to her on Facebook message, I said, the catastrophe happened when these people lost their homes. It's like, just right. How short-sighted can you be? Like this one little fire that, maybe 4 homes were damaged in total. That was the catastrophe that she was thinking about. She didn't see that all these people living out on the streets was the catastrophe.
Yeah, it's an ongoing.
And she's probably a liberal Democrat. If you asked her, she would probably say she voted for Obama and Hillary and, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, it's an ongoing catastrophe. But, it's good that people are waking up to it. And relating back to the Farm Bill, it's good that a lot of people know now what the Farm Bill is. When we first got involved in this, so many people didn't understand that food stamps, food assistance programs are all kept housed under the same wing of the government that looks after the farmers. And for a long time, there's been this, it's called a log roll, where, the mostly red state farm states said, we'll vote for your food stamp proposal if you vote for our farm subsidies. So there's been this trade-off going on in that. And now, the Tea Party caucus in particular really wants to do some damage to the food stamp program. And even Trump wants to do some damage to the USDA. SNAP, which is what we call food stamps nationally, now comprises well over 50% of the USDA's budget. So this is one of the reasons why Trump and his administration want to move the SNAP program out of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, de-link it from the Farm Bill, and put it in with Health and Human Services.
Yeah.
The Health and Human Services Department, they've already granted 6 states waivers where they can make these same kind of work requirements for Medicaid recipients. Ben Carson wants to increase the rent for people who are renting affordable housing.
And have work requirements.
Yeah, they want to put, yes, that's right. They want to put all these work requirements. They want to put all these programs together and smash them all at once, basically with work requirements and with, taking pieces of those programs and privatizing them the same way they're doing with the detention centers and the prisons and things like that.
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting because Ronald Reagan was the one to come to power basically saying the government is not going to solve the problem. It is the problem. But he would be seen as a liberal today compared to this administration.
Yeah, he couldn't even be in the Republican Party today. He'd be far left.
No, the taxes were like 50% under Reagan, and, he raised taxes and he did a lot of things. But Grover Norquist, who has that famous pledge that he makes all the Republicans sign, that I will never vote for a tax increase ever, as long as I'm in elected office. He had a phrase where he said, we need to shrink government to a size where we can drown it in a bathtub. And that is exactly what this Trump administration is doing. So And I don't really see the Democrats as performing any kind of counter to them, because they're just like, not Trump, not Trump, not Trump. And the mainstream media, same thing. The mainstream media is doing the exact same thing it did during the election. Instead of highlighting Bernie Sanders and all the wonderful things that he was going to do for people, they focused on this bombastic personality, Donald Trump. They gave him $5 billion worth of free advertising, pretty much. I mean, I'll never forget the night that Bernie won some primary and he was making his acceptance speech, and all the media is on an empty podium with the graphics saying, "Waiting for Trump." And that's what they did. And now Katie Tour from NBC, she tweeted out something the other day that we are fact checking Trump. He had 17 things that he lied about, and we are fact checking him. And my point, I tweeted back at her, why weren't you fact checking him then? Why weren't you focusing on his shady history and his corrupt deals back then? No, you were too busy getting, glorifying in your ratings. Like, who was it? Les Moonves, head of CBS, said, he's bad for the country, but he's great for business. And that's really what's so despicable. And so now, instead of focusing on the policies that Trump is doing and how he's harming so many people, they're focusing on Russia and Mueller and, all this other stuff. They're focusing on the personalities and the corruption, which is what they always do. They never focus on the policies.
This is where the Poor People's Campaign becomes a very important, part of the picture.
Yeah.
Because, Reverend Barber and his colleagues, they've identified, I think, 4 main pillars, which are poverty, militarism, racism, and I'm trying to remember what the 4th one is. But essentially, they've been gathering people in capitals all across the country, and several members of Hunger Action LA have participated in the Sacramento rallies over the last several weeks. And what I'm hoping they'll bring back attention is to the fact that a lot of these programs that we're fighting to defend now, they didn't exist in their modern form until the late 60s, early 70s. They were passed to a large extent by LBJ, but they were implemented to a high degree by Richard Nixon. And there's another one there who would be too far left by far to be in the Republican Party of today.
Yeah. Well, Bernie says, and a lot of people say, it's not just Bernie, that it's really social movements that lead and politicians that follow. And Martin Luther King was so good at that because, they were doing all the protesting and the sit-ins and the marches and everything. But at the same time, they were working on legislation and, trying to find progressive legislators to introduce, the programs that they needed to see enacted to make the change. And I said a couple of weeks ago in my election recap show about our primary election that I was so disappointed that the turnout was so low. I think it was only 22% in LA County, and the turnout among young people was the worst. And they just don't see that voting helps them. Well, maybe voting doesn't help them, but not voting certainly is going to hurt them. And the more people that opt out of their basic responsibility, which is to vote. And I say people need to do more. They need to do what we're asking them to do. They have to contact their representatives because they do take those calls seriously. And you don't have to go into a whole long song and dance. I used to do that. I used to get on the phone and give the staffer my whole spiel about why I'm for this bill or against that bill. And now I realize all you need to tell them is your zip code and whether you're for it or against it, because they're putting the little check marks. And it's really important, to do that basic responsibility.
Well, we do a lot of legislative visits as part of our work. And we were in Sacramento in the middle of May for this thing we call Hunger Action Day. And the best legislative visit I went on was to one of the Republican assembly members. I was in there by myself, but I wasn't talking to him because I don't live in his district. I had on speakerphone a disabled lady who gets SSI, who kept him on the phone and really scolded him for not looking out for the constituents of for the needs of his constituents. And, he kept trying to counter with things, and she countered for every counter of his. So it was just fantastic to see that happen. Now, I agree with you. Everyone doesn't have to be like that. It does help even if you just get on there. But, For if you're out there and you need these programs, you need food stamps, you need SSI, you need Medi-Cal, do call up your representatives, especially if they are in Republican areas, because to say it bluntly, Republicans just don't support these programs. Let them know that you vote, that you put them in and you can take them right back out, and let them know what you need. These are things that the whole country voted into power. These things didn't exist before the 1960s. People got together and pushed for them and made them happen. And now they are, and they should be a permanent part of our country's fabric.
Absolutely. I mean, we're going the wrong way. I mean, I date the year I graduated college, 1979, the beginning of these 4 decades of neoliberalism that have led to all of this privatization and idea that the private industry can do things better. No, the only thing private industry can do better is extract wealth from people and, make themselves rich and increase income and wealth inequality. So we have to wrap up now, but I just wanted to also tell people that in addition to calling, please comment on your representative's Facebook post, comment on their own post, because sometimes when you make your own independent comment, it goes off to the side where it says post by others and people don't read that. But if they make a post, this wonderful thing they did today, then you go in the comment, well, that's great, but how about you vote, no on the farm bill because, I'm only living on $900 a month and I'm going to starve if you cut my food stamps. That's the kind of thing. And also tweet them. They're very responsive to being called out in public. So we have a great call out culture in our society where everybody's calling everybody out on social media. And sometimes these things go viral. And if you feel compelled and you have time and you're of an activist bent, organize, a citizen lobby meeting at your representative's district office about this, just like we did 5 years ago with Henry Waxman. And finally, just to conclude, I want to let people know that tonight I'm driving up to Sacramento so that I could be there for tomorrow's Poor People's Campaign action. So you will next see me at 12:30 tomorrow, live streaming from the steps of the Capitol in Sacramento. I don't know what's going to happen. I know they're planning another nonviolent civil disobedience. I personally am not going to get arrested, but whatever's going to happen, I'm going to be there documenting it. So
safe travels, and thank you for doing that.
Thank you. And thank you for coming on, Frank. It's really great to see you again. And keep fighting the good fight.
Thank you. You too.
All right. Goodbye, everyone.